My name is Chris Jackson. I'm an environmental health and safety trainer for Mark Environmental Services, specializing in hazardous waste management. Hello, my name is Chris Jackson. I'm an environmental health and safety trainer for Mark Environmental Services. We specialize in hazardous waste services, hazardous waste management, HAZWOPER, OSHA, general industry, safety standards, etc. My particular area of specialty is 29 CFR, the OSHA standards, with specific regards to the general industry standards, as well as 29 CFR 1910.120, the HAZWOPER standard. We get real involved with that. In addition, I'm competent in fuel storage tanks, SPCC training, confined space training, 49 CFR DOT function-specific training, HAZCOM, powered industrial trucks, and other related hazardous waste and safety topics customized to customer-specific needs. My simulated presentation today covers an overview perspective to hazardous waste characteristics and an introduction to the beginnings of hazardous waste management. All right, now you all should have been given in the handouts I passed out a copy of the guide here, a guide on hazardous waste management for Florida, specifically for Florida's reinforced fiber manufacturers. We're going to kind of skim through the fiber manufacturing part, but the publication itself is put out by the FDEP, which is the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. As we talked about earlier, the FDEP is the state branch of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The state of Florida has adopted 40 CFR and the EPA standard in total as the guidelines, and then we also have the Florida Administrative Code that we follow that the FDEP administrates too. So not only do we have to meet the 40 CFR guidelines, we have to go down to the state level and make sure that we're in compliance with what FDEP wants us to do as well. That's a little more in-depth than what I want to get to at this point. We're going to get into that later on in the class. Specifically, as part of the regulatory overview, we talked about 40 CFR, 49 CFR, and 29 CFR, which is the OSHA, DOT, and EPA, and how they all overlap and relate to each other, and a lot of the training can cross over. What we're going to get into right now specifically is why we have to deal with hazardous waste at all in the first place, and what makes a hazardous waste. If you recall from some of the overview I mentioned, 49 CFR, which is DOT, defines what a hazardous waste is. Does anyone remember how we determine that? Exactly right. If it's listed in the hazardous materials table as a hazardous material, then EPA says, DOT says it's hazardous material, once it hits the ground, it becomes a hazardous waste. Okay? Even if we can pick it up and put it back in the container, technically now you become a recycler of that product. Once it hits the ground, by definition, it becomes a hazardous waste. So be very careful when you spill anything if you're dealing with a hazardous material. There are other areas that the DOT and the EPA get into as far as what makes a hazardous waste or hazardous material a hazardous waste. We'll get into that in more in depth as we go into the course. 3 questions I'd like to talk about, and it points out in your booklet about why we should care about hazardous waste. Well, the first reason is pretty obvious, for the health and the environment. Health of an individual, and of course the environment we live in. If we spill something on the ground in the state of Florida, we've got a very unique problem here. We've got a water table that's 1 to 2 foot in a lot of different areas. We're at about 0 foot sea level. So if we give it a whole lot of time while it's on the ground, it's going to hit the water table. Once it hits the water table, it's going to impact a lot of different areas, particularly drinking water. For argument's sake, any water in the state of Florida is considered a navigable waterway, therefore it becomes part of the drinking water. Therefore, if it hits the ground, it's an EPA issue if it hits the water table. For that reason, anytime you're handling a hazardous material and you do have a spill, you want to make very sure that one of the first things you do after you've assessed the situation is to contain the spill in order to keep it from any storm drains, water retention ponds, anything that's going to get it into the waterways. Okay? Number 1, that's the biggest area. We don't want to impact the environment any further than it already is. Second reason is cost savings. Okay? Anybody that's had to dispose of any hazardous waste at all understands that it's an extremely expensive prospect. The best way to avoid that expense is to not generate the waste. In fact, if you become what they call a large quantity generator, you have to have a working, written waste reduction program in place. Again, that's a little more in depth than I want to get into with this overview. We'll talk about that as we get more into the nuts and bolts of the system. Even if you're disposing of 1 drum of hazardous waste, on the manifest that you transport the hazardous waste on, you're signing a statement indicating that you are doing your best to reduce the hazardous waste that you're generating. EPA doesn't want hazardous waste. The focus is to change your process, change your procedure to eliminate the hazardous waste. Okay? Cost savings. The other factor you want to deal with in cost savings is to make sure that you're shipping your hazardous waste to the proper disposal facility. Okay? Where it needs to go is to a TSDF. Now, part of the overview we had this morning was what a TSDF meant, part of the acronym game we played. Who knows? Right. Treatment, storage, and disposal facility. Okay? Now, when you're sending your hazardous waste to a treatment, storage, and disposal facility, you need to make sure that they've been licensed and permitted by the state authority, but you also want to make sure they've been licensed and permitted to accept the waste that you're treating or sending them for treatment. Just because they're licensed TSDF does not mean they can handle the waste that you're trying to send them. And what will happen is they get it and find out it's not the waste they're allowed to handle. They're going to tack a surcharge onto it and send it back to you. Because remember, we talked about the cradle-to-grave liability. It's going to come back to you. It's going to come back to you. Make sure you do your homework and send it to the proper facility. Third reason you have to consider for why you should care about your hazardous waste is because of a public image. Now, it's hard to put a dollar amount on public image, but if you're Joe consumer, which company are you going to pick? The company's got belching smokestacks and leaky drums in the back 40, or the company that has their drums properly lined, properly spaced, the company that has an ISO 14001 certification program in place perhaps, that is addressing the environment, addressing how they handle their hazardous waste, addressing how they control their workplace. Well, I can't answer that for anybody else but myself, but I'm going to go for the environmentally conscious company every time. And I think if people really thought about it, they would do that. In addition, if you're doing business with a company and one of their processes by something they're doing for you creates that hazardous waste, there may be a link there. And that link is critical if the company that you're doing business with improperly disposes that hazardous waste.